At exactly 8:12 p.m., a tense call reached the 911 emergency service. The voice on the line was shaky, rushed, almost breaking. An eyewitness reported thick smoke billowing from the window of a house on Schuyler Street. Only minutes later, firefighters from the Mount Morris Volunteer Fire Department arrived at the scene. Their trucks pulled up with sirens still wailing, and the crew immediately sprang into action. The rescue team advanced into the burning home, moving carefully through the heavy smoke. Then, in the very center of the kitchen, between the stove and the dining table, they made a grim discovery. Beneath a collapsed wooden beam and the remains of a shattered cabinet lay the motionless body of a woman. The rescuers quickly realized who she was: Melissa Lameche. One firefighter, who had personally known Melissa, rushed to her side. With trembling hands, he checked for signs of life, desperately hoping for a pulse, for even the faintest breath. But the effort was in vain. The silence confirmed the unthinkable. Melissa was gone. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. At first glance, Melissa Lameche's life might have seemed indistinguishable from the lives of countless young women growing up in the heart of small-town America. Yet, those who paid closer attention soon realized that she carried within her a rare quality. Something quiet, steady, but undeniably strong. She was not the sort of person who filled a room with noise or theatrics. Instead, her presence was felt in a different way. Subtle yet powerful, like the constant rhythm of a heartbeat in an ambulance racing toward its next emergency. Melissa was born in 1993 in the state of Illinois, in the modest community of Mount Morris. This was the kind of town where children rode bicycles along tree-lined streets, neighbors greeted one another by name, and people still left their doors unlocked, trusting in the unspoken bond of familiarity. For Melissa, these surroundings offered a childhood wrapped in warmth, stability, and a sense of belonging. The culture of her family and town emphasized responsibility and compassion, values that would become guiding principles throughout her life. From an early age, Melissa displayed characteristics that seemed to foreshadow her future path. She was empathetic yet resilient, capable of steady focus when others faltered, and gifted with a calm that brought reassurance in times of stress. As the eldest of two sisters, she naturally assumed the role of protector and guide, not out of obligation, but because it was woven into her very character. Teachers often remarked that Melissa was a little adult, someone who carried herself with maturity beyond her years. Classmates confided in her, trusting her judgment, while neighbors would comment that she seemed to have the eyes of someone older, someone who understood more than she let on. Popularity was never Melissa's pursuit. She did not crave attention or recognition, but people gravitated toward her sincerity and the quiet inner strength she radiated. It was not through loud declarations, but through consistent kindness and reliability that she earned respect. These traits, invisible to some, were precisely what set her apart and laid the groundwork for the profession she would later embrace. The idea of pursuing medicine did not arrive as a sudden revelation. Rather, it was a seed planted early that grew steadily over the years. One moment, however, stood out as a clear turning point. In the 8th grade, an incident occurred on the school playground. Melissa's younger sister suffered a painful injury. While the adults around them hesitated in confusion, Melissa acted with remarkable composure. She improvised a splint from a branch and a scarf, then held her sister's hand firmly, speaking in a calm voice until the ambulance arrived. Witnessing her poise, the school nurse told her something that would remain etched in her memory. "You were created to be a paramedic." The words struck her deeply and settled into her heart like a calling waiting to be answered. When the time came to make decisions about her future, Melissa pursued this calling with determination. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in a local college and chose to study paramedicine. For many, higher education is a challenge, but Melissa took to her studies with natural ease. Yet she never allowed herself to become complacent. She knew, perhaps better than most of her peers, that mistakes in her chosen field could have consequences far beyond grades or missed opportunities. They could affect lives, For her, every exam was not just an academic hurdle, but another brick in the foundation of her chosen purpose. Unlike many students, who celebrated every milestone as an end in itself, Melissa viewed her progress as part of a much larger journey. To deepen her skills, she sought out practical experience. She took a part-time job as a hospital orderly, gaining first-hand exposure to the demands of healthcare, and volunteered with the local emergency response service. These roles often required long hours and irregular schedules, but Melissa approached them with remarkable endurance. Colleagues later remembered her as someone who never once complained about exhaustion, even after grueling night shifts. Instead, it seemed that the more difficult the circumstances, the more alive she became. Her eyes, often calm and thoughtful, lit up with a spark whenever she spoke about her work. For Melissa, every shift, every call, every patient represented an opportunity. "Each day is a chance to help someone," she would say. By the time Melissa Lameche celebrated her 25th birthday, she was already a seasoned professional in emergency medicine, carrying with her the kind of experience that many achieve only after a decade of service. She had been on the front lines of countless critical calls, rescuing drivers trapped in the twisted remains of cars after collisions, assisting mothers in delivering babies in the back of ambulances while traffic parted before flashing lights, offering calm reassurance to survivors of family crises, and stepping into situations where circumstances shifted from routine to life-threatening in seconds. Each environment demanded something different. Frigid winter nights when her hands went numb but her focus stayed sharp. Summer days where the heat radiated from the pavement as sirens wailed. Chaotic scenes filled with shouting bystanders. And tense moments when every decision had to be made under a countdown of seconds. Through it all, Melissa carried herself with the calm precision of someone who had found her calling. Her colleagues, many of whom had years more experience, frequently pointed out that her composure could serve as a lesson even to them. Where others might have faltered under pressure, Melissa displayed a rare combination: decisiveness without recklessness, courage without arrogance, and kindness that never once felt performative. She had a gift for speaking to people in crisis, her tone firm but reassuring, as though her very presence meant that help had arrived. Survivors she had treated often sought her out afterward, bringing handwritten notes, flowers, or sometimes simply heartfelt words of gratitude. Melissa valued these encounters deeply, though she never boasted of them. To her, they were not trophies, but reminders of why she chose her path. Every life saved, every pain lessened, was proof that her work mattered. Outside her uniform, Melissa remained remarkably grounded. She was not someone consumed entirely by her profession, though it shaped much of her identity. In her free time, she turned to activities that nurtured her spirit. Hiking through forest trails near Mount Morris gave her peace, offering moments of silence after days filled with urgency. She had a passion for cooking, with Italian cuisine being her specialty. Homemade pasta and carefully simmered sauces filled her kitchen with warmth. Friends recalled that Melissa often dreamed aloud of traveling to Tuscany, imagining herself walking among vineyards and old stone villages, tasting food prepared by locals, and breathing in the slower rhythm of life far from the sound of sirens. Her home reflected her personality, simple yet full of life. There were always fresh flowers on the table, little reminders of beauty even in routine days. The refrigerator bore colorful drawings from her nephews alongside candid photographs of her colleagues, snapshots of laughter and shared victories in the demanding world of emergency work. Though she lived by the unpredictable rhythm of her profession, she never lost sight of family ties. Her sister Cassie was her closest confidant. Melissa often called Cassie her rock, relying on her for emotional balance. They spoke daily, sharing everything, moments of joy, deep fatigue, and even the quiet doubts that Melissa rarely voiced to anyone else. Their bond was so strong that, as relatives later recalled, Cassie often sensed when something was troubling Melissa even before words were spoken. The year 2020 brought an unexpected turning point in Melissa's life, one that she welcomed with open arms. She discovered she was pregnant. Though the pregnancy had not been planned, Melissa greeted the news not with fear, but with a quiet determination. For her, this was not a setback, but an opportunity, a chance to channel her nurturing spirit into a new role. She was not in a stable romantic relationship at the time, yet she remained resolute in her choice to embrace motherhood. Family and friends later described how she seemed to glow during those months, radiating a sense of anticipation and hope. She threw herself wholeheartedly into preparation. Melissa had already chosen a name for the baby, spent evenings browsing parenting books, and spoke excitedly about decorating the nursery. She made lists of supplies, researched the safest cribs, and practiced recipes she hoped to cook for her child one day. Even as her pregnancy progressed and the physical challenges increased, she continued her shifts. Colleagues recalled her walking into the station with the same determined stride as always, refusing special treatment despite gentle encouragement from others to slow down. When asked if she was afraid to face such a responsibility largely on her own, Melissa would simply smile and respond, "I'm not alone. I already carry a whole life with me, and I'm ready." Yet beneath this surface of serenity, her circumstances were far more complicated. The father of her unborn child was Matthew Plott, a fellow first responder who, like Melissa, had chosen a life of service as both firefighter and paramedic. Their relationship had begun in the glow of shared experiences on the job, the adrenaline of rescues, the satisfaction of teamwork, the understanding of long nights spent on call. At first, their bond seemed natural, even inevitable. But as the months passed, cracks began to appear. Matthew grew distant, his enthusiasm for the future noticeably weaker than Melissa's. Melissa was not the kind of person who carried bitterness in her heart. Even when life did not unfold the way she had hoped, she preferred to face challenges with quiet resilience rather than resentment. She often told her sister Cassie that no matter what happened, she would manage, for herself, for her family, and above all, for the new life she was preparing to welcome into the world. By the autumn of 2020, her thoughts revolved almost entirely around the future, and that future was full of hope. November arrived, bringing with it a mixture of anticipation and gentle nerves. For Melissa, this month was meant to be one of preparation and celebration. She spoke with friends and colleagues about her plans for maternity leave, about the holidays just around the corner, and about how eager she was to finally meet her baby. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been meaningful to the Lamesh family, but that year they carried a special weight. Melissa was about to become a mother, and she described the upcoming holidays as the beginning of a completely new chapter. November 25th, 2020, fell on a Wednesday, 2 days before Thanksgiving. Outside, the familiar grayness of a Midwestern autumn draped itself across rural Illinois. The trees had long shed their leaves. The air was sharp with chill, and the streets of Mount Morris were quiet, with only the occasional car rolling past under the glow of streetlights. Yet inside the modest house on West Schuyler Street, where Melissa lived, there was a very different atmosphere. On this day, 2 days before Thanksgiving, Melissa Lamesh was planning to celebrate the evening with her loved ones. Her father was away on business, and she was alone in the house to prepare food, sort through gifts, and rest a little, in anticipation of the fact that in just 24 hours, she might see her baby for the first time. Her bag with things for the hospital was already at the door. Everything was ready. Documents, baby clothes, even a list of contacts in case of an emergency call to the midwife. Neighbors later recalled that she seemed calm that evening. One of them, driving by, noticed her in the kitchen window. She was standing at the stove, stirring something, with one hand holding the belt on her stomach. Melissa was in her last weeks of pregnancy, but she didn't allow herself to sit idle. Neither fatigue nor heaviness prevented her from living life to the fullest. She sent a voicemail to her sister, in which she grinned as she tried to bake a pie using her grandmother's recipe. Although, I think I oversalted the filling again. The last messages from her phone were sent around 6:50 p.m. After that, silence. What happened between 6:50 p.m. and 8:12 p.m. was never fully known to anyone except one person. And that person would later become the central figure in the most high-profile criminal case in Ogle County in decades. But at that time, no one could have guessed that the evening, which began as a prelude to a new life, would turn into a terrible finale. At 8:12 p.m., an alarming call came to the 911 emergency service. An eyewitness reported thick smoke coming from the window of a house on Schuyler Street, and flames were quickly spreading throughout the interior. The call was brief, almost nervous. Firefighters from the Mount Morris Volunteer Fire Department were on the scene within minutes. Among them were paramedics, Melissa's colleagues, who of course did not yet know who exactly they were about to save. The scene on the scene was alarming. The house looked relatively intact on the outside, but inside, a fire was raging. Part of the kitchen and hallway were already ablaze, with thick smoke rising to the ceiling. The front door was locked. The firefighters forced it open to get inside. One of them would later say in an interview, "At first, we thought there was no one inside. It looked like an empty house, but the fire was spreading too fast, unnaturally fast. For a building of that type and the weather conditions, the fire was spreading too fast, as if someone had given it an advantage." One of the firefighters, without waiting for the fire to be extinguished, rushed inside toward the kitchen. That was where, according to the initial assessment, the epicenter of the fire was. The floors were charred. The ceiling began to collapse. At some point, it seemed that the rescue operation would become too risky, but no one was going to retreat. Meanwhile, relatives, neighbors, and passers-by began to arrive at the scene. Among them was Melissa's father, who returned home to see flames in a blocked street. His scream when he realized that the house was on fire and his daughter should be inside was heard by everyone nearby. The firefighters could not say anything. There was too little information. The house was burning down. The first suspicions arose even then. Why this particular house? Why in the evening, on the eve of the holiday? Why did the fire break out so quickly? By 9 p.m., the fire was localized. The rescue team began checking the interior, room by room, with flashlights in the smoky space. And then, in the very heart of the kitchen, on the floor between the stove and the dining table, under a collapsed beam and part of the cabinet, they discovered a body. The woman, unconscious. It became clear on the spot. This was Melissa Lameche. One of the rescuers, who personally knew Melissa, rushed to her, trying to find signs of life. All was in vain. Resuscitation measures began right on the spot, but it was too late. The paramedic, who saved dozens of others, could not be saved herself. Doctors recorded death. Officially. Later, forensic experts would clarify. Melissa died before the fire engulfed the building. News of her death spread throughout the county with lightning speed. Local ambulance services and fire departments were shocked. Melissa was one of their own. She was known, respected, appreciated. Now all this disappeared overnight. But how exactly? Why? And most importantly, who could need the death of a woman who did no harm to anyone? These are the questions that the investigation has yet to focus on. But even in those first hours, in the ashes of the fire, there was something strange. Too many details did not fit into the usual picture of an accident. And soon the truth would come out. Disturbing, difficult, and not at all accidental. From the moment Melissa Lameche was discovered, the atmosphere around the incident changed instantly. The initial theory of an accident, a fire caused by faulty wiring or kitchen equipment, lasted only a few hours. By the morning of November 26th, the Ogle County Arson and Crime Unit's investigation team had arrived at the scene. The evidence found in the burned remains of the house did not fit the scenario of a domestic fire, and the more investigators delved into the details, the clearer it became. Melissa did not die in the fire. The fire was intended to cover up what happened to her before the fire. The work of the investigative team continued almost without a break for several weeks. The expert team began by examining the scene. The fire started in the kitchen, but not in the area of electrical appliances, but closer to the floor, which already raised suspicions. Investigators found traces of a substance with an odor characteristic of gasoline. Later, a laboratory analysis would confirm that a flammable substance had been used in the house. This meant only one thing: arson. Moreover, there were 2 fires, one in the kitchen, the second in the bedroom. This ruled out the possibility of an accidental fire. Traces of gasoline in different rooms confirmed that someone had deliberately wanted to destroy as much evidence as possible. Another alarming moment. The front door was locked from the inside, but the window in the back of the house was broken. Investigators immediately assumed that the intruder had left the house through this window, deliberately breaking it to stage an emergency rescue or theft. But fingerprints from the frame were smudged, and there were no traces of blood, indicating the presence of gloves. This added thoughtfulness and calculation to the picture. The fire was not the result of panic, but a pre-planned action. The next step was an autopsy. The pathological examination confirmed the terrible. Melissa died before the fire. There were no combustion products in her lungs, no soot, no traces of carbon monoxide. This meant that there was only one plausible scenario: deliberate murder. The circle of suspects began to form quickly. Melissa was a person who had no enemies. Her reputation among colleagues and relatives was impeccable. She was not involved in conflicts, had no debts, was not in relationships that could be called toxic. Almost. With one caveat: Matthew Plott, an ex-boyfriend, colleague, and, according to her relatives, the father of her future child. It was his name that was heard again and again in conversations with friends, relatives, and colleagues. And it was with him that Melissa spoke the day before the tragedy. Moreover, he was in the same area at the time of the fire, and did not report it, despite the fact that, according to witnesses, he saw smoke. Investigators turned to her phone. Melissa's smartphone, miraculously surviving the fire thanks to a thick case, became a key source of information. She made her last call at 19:06. The conversation lasted 28 minutes. With whom? It was initially unknown. The subscriber was listed under the name M Operators. Established that this was Matthew Plott's number. Then text messages came. I talked to my sister. Everything is decided. You can come if you want, but it's not too late. 40 minutes before the fire started. Then, silence. Investigators questioned Matthew. He claimed to have been at home at the time of the tragedy, but his alibi immediately failed. When they analyzed the ambulance station's entry and exit log, they discovered that Plott had deliberately changed his duty schedule for the day of the tragedy. A coincidence that was too close to being accidental. His phone's location, thanks to GPS and mobile network data, placed him near Melissa's father's house between 7:45 p.m. and 8:10 p.m. That is exactly at the moment when, according to investigators, the murder occurred and the fire started. When asked directly whether he had been at her house, Matthew answered in the negative. But later, when he was shown the geolocation data, he changed his testimony. I drove up, but changed my mind about going in. An obvious lie. One of the neighbors said he had seen a suspicious car near the house shortly before the fire, but did not attach any importance to it. Later, this turned out to be critical evidence. Investigators checked the neighbors' surveillance cameras. One of them, installed on the house across the street, recorded a gray pickup truck entering the street at 7:48 p.m. and leaving at 8:11 p.m. The model and number matched Matthew's car. He denied parking near the house, but an examination established that it was his tire tracks that were on the wet ground near the entrance. In addition, his boots, seized during the search, contained microparticles of ash and gasoline identical to that used in the house. One more piece of evidence became decisive. On one of the canisters found in the basement of the house, investigators found a fingerprint that did not belong to Melissa. It was urgently compared with the database. A match. Matthew Plott. He claimed that he never touched these canisters and was not in the basement of Melissa's father's house. This turned out to be a lie. Moreover, gloves with soot and gasoline residue were found in his garage. Inside one of them was sweat, from which DNA was extracted. The match with Matthew's profile was unmistakable. With each passing day, the murder version, initially frightening in its cruelty, turned into a documented fact. The evidence formed a clear chain: call, arrival, murder, arson, escape. The motive, it would seem, was banal but vile. Matthew did not want to become a father. According to Melissa's friends, he repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with her pregnancy, hinted that this would all complicate his life. And when he realized that it would not be possible to change Melissa's decision, he decided to get rid of the problem radically. When examining the suspect's computer hard drive, search queries on the topics how to disguise a murder and how to simulate a fire were found. A psychological portrait compiled by a criminal analyst confirmed. Plott demonstrated signs of passive-aggressive behavior, emotional immaturity, and fear of losing control. He saw the pregnancy as a threat to his own stability, especially in the context of a pandemic and job instability. By early December 2020, the Ogle County District Attorney's Office had issued a warrant for Matthew Plott's arrest. He was arrested that same day, at home. He offered no resistance. Initially, he claimed that he knew nothing, but under pressure from the evidence and in the presence of an attorney, he asked to exercise his right to remain silent. The charges were formally filed: first-degree murder, arson, destruction of evidence. He was not released on bail. The community was shocked. Local media, initially cautious in their wording, now wrote openly, "This is not a tragedy, but a planned crime." Melissa's colleagues, paramedics, firefighters, EMTs, organized a memorial ceremony where they read out not only Melissa's name, but also that of her unborn son. People stood with flashlights, some in uniform, others with children's toys. Everyone understood. This was not just an act of violence. This was betrayal by one of their own. Now all that was left was to wait for the trial. The morning of January 3rd, 2021. The small Ogle County courtroom, usually quiet and routine, was packed to capacity. The benches were filled with reporters, the victim's colleagues, relatives, friends, and concerned residents. They had all come to hear how the law would assess the actions of a man whose cruelty had shocked even the most seasoned investigators. In the dock was Matthew Plott, 37, no previous convictions, a local paramedic, the father of Melissa Lemesh's unborn child, accused of murdering a woman, arson, and destroying evidence. Nothing remained of the once confident, charming professional. Before the public sat a pale, haggard man, avoiding eye contact and hiding his hands under the table. The trial immediately attracted increased media attention. But despite the public pressure, Judge Joanne Mitchell set the tone. In this courtroom, emotions will be left at the door. Only the facts will speak here. And there were enough facts to cut to the bone. The district attorney's office, representing the prosecution, built its case methodically, step by step. Chief Prosecutor James Haller began by establishing a motive that he called mean, selfish, and absolutely inexcusable: an unwillingness to accept the responsibility of fatherhood. At the first hearing, the indictment was read: first-degree murder, premeditated and committed with particular cruelty; arson with intent to conceal a crime; destruction of physical evidence; and criminal negligence resulting in the death. These lines sounded more than just a legal technicality. Each one seemed like a blow to the man sitting across from him, who had once called himself Melissa's friend. The prosecution called witnesses one by one. The first were the firefighters who arrived on the scene. They described in detail the condition of the house, the speed with which the fire spread, and the unnatural nature of the blaze. The pathologist spoke next and confirmed that Melissa had died before the fire. It was a moment that the judge allowed to be experienced in silence. No lawyerly rhetoric was needed to feel the weight of what was happening. The key witness was a forensic scientist who presented DNA, shoe prints, and fingerprints. He pointed out the match between Plott's boots and the prints at the crime scene, confirmed the presence of his DNA on the glove found near the burnt canisters, and the presence of his fingerprint on the handle of one of the canisters. The jury was silent, taking notes. Every step, every action of the defendant was now laid out before them, like an X-ray. Next, the prosecutor's office presented the geolocation data of Matthew's phone. On the day of the murder, his mobile was 60 meters away from the house where the fire occurred, exactly at the time when, according to the investigation, the fatal blow was dealt. His lawyer tried to challenge the accuracy of the GPS, but experts confidently refuted doubts. The error did not exceed 5 meters. And then, a video from a surveillance camera on which a gray pickup truck appears on the street at 1948 and leaves it at 2011. The number matched the number of the defendant's car. All the details fit into a picture that left no room for chance. The defense's defensive strategy was built around the fact that the evidence was circumstantial. The lawyer argued that the defendant had no direct motive for the murder and hinted that psychological pressure from Melissa's family could have led him to an emotional breakdown, but not to a crime. A version was also put forward that the real criminal could have used Matthew's clothes and belongings to frame him. The court took these arguments with restraint, and the prosecution decisively. Clothes can be used as a substitute, but not correspondence, not fingerprints, not genetic material, not the words of Melissa herself sent in her last messages. One of the turning points of the trial came when text messages between Melissa and her sister were read to the court. In them, she wrote directly, "If he yells again today, I will leave forever. But I hope he will just understand that I will not back down." These words were sent a day before the tragedy. Against the background of other evidence, they sounded especially heavy, like a premonition of their own fate. Towards the end of the third week of hearings, the prosecution finished presenting its case. The floor passed to the defense. Matthew Plott refused to testify, using his right to remain silent. This decision caused tension in the courtroom. According to analysts, it was this gesture, an unwillingness to talk, not even an attempt to explain, that became the final point for many jurors. The speeches of the relatives of the deceased left an indelible impression. Melissa's sister barely held back tears, describing how kind, patient, and strong her sister was. Her father spoke hoarsely, briefly, without pathos. "He took not only my daughter from me, but also my grandson. This is not just death. This is a piece of my soul torn out." After his words, the judge announced a short break. After almost 4 weeks of hearings, dozens of witnesses, and expert opinions, the jury went to deliberate. This was the final phase, and the most unpredictable. The district attorney did not make predictions, but in the corridors of the court it was felt. The evidence base was so strong that the chance of acquittal was almost zero. On the fourth day of deliberations, the jury returned to the courtroom. The judge asked everyone to stand. The clerk read the verdict. "Find the defendant, Matthew Plott, guilty on all counts." The judge announced the sentence: life imprisonment without parole. The silence in the courtroom lasted for a few seconds, then a quiet cry. Melissa's mother covered her face with her hands. Someone exhaled. Someone crossed themselves. And not a single muscle moved on Plott's face, as if he still did not understand what he had done. The trial was over, but the memory of Melissa and her child did not disappear. April 11th, at that critical moment, based on emergency dispatch records, Martin McNeil made a desperate call to 911. By the time the ambulance finally reached the McNeil home, an agonizing 30 minutes after the initial emergency call, precious time had already slipped away. Paramedics rushed into the house, carrying the heavy weight of life-saving equipment. They quickly made their way to the bathroom, where they discovered Michelle McNeil lying unresponsive in the bathtub. Without delay, the medical team sprang into action. Every second counted, and every movement was executed with urgency and precision. The paramedics worked tirelessly, using every life-saving measure they knew, their focus unshaken, to revive Michelle and bring her back to life. Once at the hospital, the scene shifted from urgency to inevitability. Despite the relentless efforts of the emergency room staff, despite all procedures, all attempts, there was nothing more they could do. Michelle McNeil was officially pronounced dead on April 11, 2007. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Michelle Summers came into the world on January 15, 1957, in the peaceful community of Concord, California. Born into a warm, deeply faithful Mormon family, Michelle's early years were filled with love, discipline, and the powerful presence of spiritual values that shaped every aspect of her upbringing. Her parents, devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, believed in hard work, community service, and the importance of nurturing their children with compassion, respect, and strong moral guidance. The Summers home radiated warmth, a place where kindness, daily prayer, and a shared meal around the dinner table were not just routine but sacred rituals. From a young age, Michelle radiated promise. She was bright, driven, and immensely talented. At school, she stood out not only for her intelligence and academic achievement, but also for her elegance and natural charm. She played the violin with extraordinary grace, a talent that won her accolades in school orchestras and regional music events. She was also a spirited cheerleader, a positive force who uplifted those around her. Peers and teachers alike were drawn to her gentle energy, quiet confidence, and effortless beauty. As she grew into her teenage years, Michelle began to enter local beauty pageants, where she consistently impressed judges with her poise, eloquence, and modest confidence. In 1976, she was crowned Miss Concord, a title that seemed to encapsulate everything she was: graceful, articulate, compassionate, and radiant. The importance of faith remained central in Michelle's life well into adulthood. The Summers family was tightly woven into the fabric of their church community. Weekly services, youth group meetings, volunteer events, and Bible study gatherings were all part of their spiritual rhythm. It was during one such church-affiliated singles gathering that Michelle first encountered Martin McNeil, a young man who would alter the course of her life forever. Martin presented himself with striking polish, well-dressed, clean-cut, and brimming with self-assurance. There was something calculated about his presence, an intensity that was both magnetic and slightly enigmatic. Michelle, who had always been open-hearted and trusting, felt drawn to his charisma. Within weeks, the two began dating seriously. Friends noted that things moved quickly between them, perhaps too quickly, but Michelle was swept up in the whirlwind romance. Within a month, she and Martin were married in a quiet yet joyous ceremony attended by family and friends. To those looking in from the outside, it seemed like a perfect match. Two bright, attractive young people with shared religious beliefs and a seemingly aligned vision for the future. In the early years of marriage, Michelle poured her heart into building a happy home. She dreamed of having a large family, of nurturing her children the same way her own parents had nurtured her. And over the next several years, that dream came to life. Michelle and Martin welcomed 4 children into the world: Rachel, Vanessa, Alexis, and Damien. Each child was cherished deeply, and Michelle's world revolved around their needs, milestones, and joys. She managed their expansive, well-kept home with quiet pride. Every corner of the house reflected her touch, from the homemade meals that greeted the children after school to the carefully packed lunches and ironed Sunday clothes. Neighbors often remarked that she seemed to have it all together. She was elegant, but never showy, attentive, yet never overbearing. As Michelle built a haven for their growing family, Martin immersed himself in his professional ambitions. He pursued not just one, but 2 prestigious fields, medicine and law. He earned degrees in both and eventually established himself as a licensed psychiatrist. He was bright, no doubt about that, and he knew it. He relished his credentials and was quick to share them, often reminding others of his achievements and elite education. Though admired by many for his apparent success, Martin's pride sometimes came across as arrogance. While Michelle's humility grounded their family, Martin's need for validation often made him appear distant or self-involved. As years passed, the McNeil family grew even larger. In an act that appeared noble and generous, Michelle and Martin decided to adopt 3 more girls. Now a mother of 7, Michelle continued to meet every responsibility with patience, strength, and grace. She attended every school performance, every parent-teacher conference, and every medical appointment. From dawn until long past dusk, Michelle's days were consumed by motherhood, caretaking, and ensuring that her family thrived. To outsiders, they looked like the embodiment of the American dream. A beautiful family, a stately home, accomplished parents, and children who were thriving. But beneath the surface, unsettling patterns had begun to emerge. Shadows that even Michelle, with all her grace and strength, could not completely ignore. Despite his profession, Martin McNeil's own mental stability was becoming increasingly erratic. While trained to support and heal others through psychological insight, he seemed unable or unwilling to confront his own emotional turbulence. He could be moody, controlling, and at times manipulative. In private moments, he would unleash intense mood swings that Michelle often absorbed without complaint. Over time, his unpredictability cast a long shadow over the home Michelle worked so hard to preserve. By the time Martin reached his 50s, a noticeable transformation began. One that was subtle at first, but quickly evolved into something that worried Michelle deeply. He became fixated on his appearance. He shed weight rapidly, started spending long hours at the gym, and took to tanning with an almost compulsive regularity. Michelle, ever observant, sensed that this wasn't merely about health. There was something else behind the change. Something unspoken, unsettling. Martin's absences from the home became more frequent. He claimed it was work. Patients, consultations, conferences. But Michelle's instincts told her otherwise. He seemed more distant, more secretive, and less connected to the family. Friends who visited remarked quietly about his growing aloofness, his emotional withdrawal. Eventually, Michelle confided in her daughter Alexis. She shared her concerns and admitted that she no longer fully trusted her husband. Together, Michelle and Alexis decided to look deeper. One night, driven by intuition and heartache, they accessed Martin's phone records. What they found chilled them. Repeated calls to the same unfamiliar number, often late at night. The name associated with the number was Gypsy Willis. Neither Michelle nor Alexis recognized the name, but the frequency of communication, especially at such odd hours, spoke volumes. Michelle decided to confront Martin directly. Calm but firm, she asked him to explain. He denied everything. There was no affair, he claimed. Gypsy was a professional contact, nothing more. He dismissed her suspicions and, in a particularly cruel twist, suggested that perhaps Michelle's concern stemmed from her own insecurities. He urged her to consider cosmetic surgery, implying that it might boost her confidence and perhaps even rekindle their connection. The comment was wounding. Michelle had never felt the need to alter her appearance to feel worthy. But now, after years of service and sacrifice, the seeds of doubt had been sown. But the moment she mentioned even the slightest interest, Martin seized on it with unnerving speed and intensity. What Michelle had imagined would be a long-term consideration, perhaps something she'd planned for later in the year, was suddenly being rushed into immediate reality. Martin pushed for the surgery to be scheduled right away, not in the summer as Michelle had hoped, but within days. The urgency in his tone felt unnatural. Spring break, he said, would offer the perfect timing. Alexis, their daughter who was then in medical school, would be home for just long enough to assist, and there would be no better opportunity. Michelle voiced her concerns. She wasn't ready. She needed more time to mentally prepare and consider all the risks involved. But Martin would not entertain delay. Before Michelle could solidify her hesitation or reconsider the idea altogether, Martin had already taken matters into his own hands. He booked the consultation, confirmed the surgeon, and fixed the surgery date, all without waiting for her full, unpressured consent. At the preoperative consultation, Michelle barely spoke. Martin dominated the room, speaking not as a concerned spouse, but as someone accustomed to being in charge. With a clinical detachment cloaked in confidence, he rattled off the procedures he believed she needed. A facelift was just the beginning. He requested additional work. A rhinoplasty to subtly reshape her nose, a blepharoplasty to lift her eyelids, and even adjustments to refine her chin and jawline. Michelle, already overwhelmed, found herself sinking into silence as the list expanded. The total time under anesthesia would exceed 9 hours, a lengthy and taxing ordeal for any patient, especially one undergoing multiple invasive procedure in a single session. The approval came swiftly. It likely helped that Martin was a licensed physician. He carried authority, and few questioned his judgment. On April 3, 2007, Michelle entered the operating room for what she believed would be the beginning of a new chapter, one of healing, rejuvenation, and possibly reconnection with her husband. The procedures were intense, and the aftermath was everything one might expect. But Michelle was prepared for that. What she was not prepared for were the medications that followed. Unusual in both type and combination, the post-operative regimen Martin insisted upon raised quiet red flags. He requested an array of 5 potent medications, including multiple painkillers and sleep aids, drugs that, when taken together, are rarely prescribed in tandem due to their risk of interactions. Martin rationalized the prescriptions by claiming Michelle had a low tolerance for pain and required stronger than average relief. He offered assurances that, as a physician himself, he would oversee her recovery personally and with care. Despite his promises, hospital staff recommended she remain under observation for an extra night. Michelle's blood pressure was elevated, and she described feeling unusually anxious and unwell. Eventually, the hospital released her, and Alexis, attentive and concerned, brought her mother home. But Martin quickly stepped in again. He reminded Alexis that he had cleared his schedule and would handle all aspects of Michelle's recovery. Though reluctant, Alexis allowed herself to step back, believing her father's medical background meant Michelle was in safe hands. The next morning, Alexis returned to the house. What she found left her shaken. Michelle, always the picture of composure and self-reliance, seemed dazed, fragile, and mentally clouded. Her speech was slow, her movements heavy. Deeply alarmed, Alexis confronted her father directly. Martin, in a calm yet dismissive tone, admitted he might have over-medicated Michelle slightly, but brushed it off as nothing serious. He said she simply needed to rest. Alexis, however, was no longer just a concerned daughter. She was a medical student with growing clinical knowledge and instincts. Something didn't sit right. These symptoms weren't ordinary post-surgical fatigue. The medication combination, the dosage, the lack of visible improvement, it all pointed to a recovery process that was not only mishandled, but potentially dangerous. From that moment forward, Alexis took control. She collected the pill bottles, monitored each dosage, and stayed by her mother's side for the remainder of her spring break. She watched carefully, rarely leaving Michelle alone, hoping her presence would protect her mother. Still, the clock was ticking. Her spring break was drawing to a close, and she would soon have to return to school. On the final evening before her departure, Alexis shared a quiet, deeply intimate moment with her mother. Michelle was in the bathtub, her eyes still bandaged, her body weary. As Alexis gently washed her hair, Michelle spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She confided something that chilled Alexis to her core. Michelle explained that Martin had been giving her pills she didn't recognize, medications she had not been told about. She admitted she could no longer tell what she was taking because of the bandages over her eyes. She asked Alexis to describe the shape and color of each pill so she could learn them by touch. It was a haunting moment, one of vulnerability, awareness, and fear. Then Michelle said something even more sobering. "If anything happens to me," she said with quiet finality, "make sure it wasn't your father." Alexis was stunned. The words hung in the air like a cold draft through a closed door. What did her mother mean? Was this just fear talking or a warning? Unfortunately, there was no time to explore it further. The following day, Alexis had to return to school. Still, she spoke with her mother that morning, April 11th, shortly before 9 a.m. Michelle sounded more alert than she had in days. Her voice was clear, her tone light. She told Alexis that Martin had been surprisingly gentle and kind since she had returned to school, more attentive than usual. It offered a glimmer of hope, and for a brief moment, Alexis allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst had passed. That would be the last time they spoke. Later that morning, Martin reportedly had a scheduled commitment, a professional engagement at a medical trade event. He left the house and returned just before noon. What he found, according to his account, was silence. Michelle didn't respond when he called for her. The house was quiet, too quiet. After searching the main floor, he entered the bathroom. There, he discovered Michelle, unresponsive in the tub. In that moment, according to emergency call logs, Martin phoned 911. But rather than speaking with calm and clarity, the call was marked by agitation and hostility. He barked at the dispatcher, responded impatiently to routine questions, and abruptly ended the call without providing their full address. When dispatchers attempted to call back, he again responded with irritation and hung up a second time. On a third attempt, he finally gave an address, one that was incorrect. Whether it was an honest mistake or something more deliberate remains uncertain. When the ambulance finally arrived at the McNeil residence, 30 long minutes after the first emergency call, time had already begun slipping away. Paramedics rushed inside, their bags heavy with the tools of life-saving work, and found Michelle McNeil unresponsive in the bathtub. Without hesitation, the team began CPR, defibrillation, airway management. Each second critical, each motion precise. The paramedics worked with intensity and focus, performing every technique at their disposal, their goal singular: bring Michelle back. But while they fought quietly and professionally to restore a heartbeat, a troubling distraction grew louder behind them. Martin. From the moment they entered the scene, Martin's behavior had stood out. Not because of grief, but because of its tone. It was not sorrow that filled the air around him. It was something more unsettling. His shouting resumed the pattern established in the 911 call: aggressive, commanding, and emotionally erratic. Instead of comforting his wife or stepping aside in desperation, he barked questions no one had answers to. At times, he seemed to yell at Michelle herself, demanding a response she could no longer give. To the emergency responders, Martin's presence became an obstacle. While they had been trained to manage chaos, this brand of distress was more difficult. It wasn't confusion or panic, it was volatility. At first, some suspected it might be shock, a natural response to sudden trauma. But others sensed something different, something that didn't feel organic. His reactions appeared, to some, less like spontaneous anguish and more like theater. Loud, dramatic, but hollow. Almost as if a script was being followed, with each outburst perfectly timed to draw attention. While the team continued their efforts, Martin momentarily stepped out of the room. During that brief moment of quiet, he made a phone call to his daughter, Alexis. The voice on the other end was the one that had worried about this exact outcome for days. The message Martin delivered was short, clipped, and disturbingly sterile. There was no panic in his tone, no tremble of emotion in his words. He didn't offer an explanation, just a fact. For Alexis, the chill in that call confirmed what she had feared. Her mother's earlier whisper now echoed louder than ever in her mind. "If anything happens to me, make sure it wasn't your father." Within moments, Alexis was racing to the airport, desperate to reach Utah. Back at the hospital, chaos gave way to inevitability. The emergency team tried everything. They pushed medications, administered repeated compressions, and checked vitals for any sign of return. 45 minutes passed. Michelle's heart never restarted. She was officially pronounced deceased on April 11th, 2007. Despite Martin's last-minute plea, reportedly offering paramedics $10,000 to continue efforts, there was nothing more that could be done. It was over. Michelle, a devoted mother of 7, a cherished sister, and a woman known for her warmth, poise, and quiet strength, was gone. The cause of death, according to the initial medical examiner's findings, was listed as natural. The report cited myocarditis, underlying cardiovascular disease, and high blood pressure as contributing factors. There were no signs noted of foul play. No investigation was opened. On paper, it seemed tragic, but ordinary. A post-operative complication that sadly led to the loss of a life. But to Michelle's inner circle, her children, her siblings, and especially Alexis, nothing about this outcome felt ordinary. Nothing about her final days seemed accidental. The family's grief was profound. Her children were shell-shocked. Her sisters and brothers were stunned. Michelle had been the heart of the family, a quiet leader, a nurturer. The idea that her life had ended so suddenly and without suspicion didn't sit right with any of them. For Alexis, who had witnessed the medication regimen firsthand, the conclusion was devastatingly simple. Her mother hadn't been taken by nature. She had been misled, manipulated, and possibly deliberately over-medicated. Even before Alexis boarded her flight, she was already thinking about evidence. She called her sister Rachel in urgency. Her request was specific and clear. Search the house. Michelle's medications had to be collected and documented. The exact pill counts mattered. She needed to determine what Michelle had been given, what had been taken, and whether the dosage aligned with any legitimate medical protocol. But by the time Rachel entered the house, the medications were gone. When she asked Martin where the prescriptions were, he responded with vague shrugs and wandering explanations. Maybe the police had taken them, he said. Perhaps the pills were misplaced during the hospital rush. He suggested, almost casually, that they might have been left in the garage or possibly thrown away. His answers shifted depending on who was asking. But then another detail surfaced. This time from Damien, Michelle's young son. Damien confessed to his sisters that Martin had instructed him to dispose of the medications entirely. Specifically, he was told to flush them all down the toilet. When asked why, Damien recalled Martin saying the sight of the bottles was too painful, that seeing them only deepened his sadness. But to Alexis, the timing felt far too convenient. And the motive suspect. Disposing of the medication not only eliminated critical evidence, but also cut off the family's only remaining path to understanding what Michelle had truly endured in her final days. And then, just days after the tragedy, Martin's behavior raised even more eyebrows. With stunning speed, he began planning the funeral. There was no long deliberation, no family meeting, no gentle coordination with Michelle's relatives. Within 3 days of her passing, he had arranged the service. But what disturbed Michelle's loved ones most was not the speed. It was the exclusion. Martin made it explicitly clear to Michelle's family. They were not welcome. In a move that felt both cold and calculated, he told her siblings that if they attempted to attend the funeral, he would call the police. The threat was direct. The message, unmistakable. For Michelle's brothers and sisters, grieving, confused, and angry, the decision to stay away was agonizing. But they complied, hoping to avoid further distress for Michelle's children. What remained of the ceremony was somber, quiet, and controlled entirely by Martin. But one unfamiliar presence stood out. A young brunette woman, whose name no one recognized, attended the service. She sat quietly. She didn't introduce herself, nor did she approach the family. At the time, her presence raised only mild curiosity. Perhaps she was a friend of Martin's, maybe a co-worker. But in the days that followed, this unknown guest would take on a far greater and more disturbing significance. In the aftermath of the funeral, Martin made yet another swift decision. He announced that he would be bringing someone into the home to help with day-to-day care. With 4 daughters still living at home, Michelle's oldest daughter was ready to put her future on hold. She offered to temporarily pause her studies and return home to care for her younger siblings, especially the youngest girls who still desperately needed maternal guidance. But her offer was quickly rejected. Martin, unmoved by her gesture, declined without hesitation. He told her it wasn't necessary. "You have your own life," he said flatly. "You shouldn't sacrifice your career." Instead, He informed her that he had already found someone else to take on the role of caretaker. Someone who, he claimed, could provide the support the family needed. Then came the name, Gypsy. When Alexis and her sister Rachel heard it, their stomachs dropped. The same name had haunted them ever since their mother's quiet suspicions months earlier. Could it really be her? Gypsy Willis, the woman whose late-night phone calls to Martin had triggered so much unease in Michelle? The woman whose name had been attached to a pattern of secrecy? They asked Martin directly. He didn't deny it. Yes, he confirmed. It was that Gypsy. But he was quick to shut down any further speculation. There was no affair, he insisted. She was just helping out. A friend, nothing more. But within just 2 weeks of Michelle's burial, Gypsy Willis moved into the McNeil household. Not into the guest room. Not as a live-in helper. She became a central figure in the home, without explanation, without title. Yet she wasn't fulfilling any of the expected duties of a caretaker. She didn't cook. She didn't help with cleaning. She didn't engage meaningfully with the children. In fact, she largely kept to herself, unless she was by Martin's side, which she nearly always was. To the children, she didn't resemble a nanny or a guardian. She resembled a partner. The two behaved like a couple, often inseparable, with Gypsy showing affection toward Martin openly. She catered to him, watched over him, and even corrected the children on his behalf. It was as if the role Michelle once held had been quietly replaced, with alarming speed and eerie familiarity. By July of that same year, barely 3 months after Michelle's passing, Martin took Gypsy to meet her parents. It was a visit that stunned those who later learned about it. There, in front of her family, Martin openly professed his love. He spoke glowingly of Gypsy, declaring her the one true love of his life, something he boldly claimed he had never felt for Michelle. And before the trip ended, Martin proposed marriage. Alexis and Rachel were heartbroken, appalled. Their mother's memory was still vivid. Her voice, her laughter, her final words still etched into their minds. And yet, their father appeared to be moving on at lightning speed with someone who had long stood at the center of their suspicions. When Alexis tried to confront him about it, the fallout was swift and severe. Martin, no longer interested in hiding his hostility, told Alexis she was no longer welcome in the family home. Then he went a step further. He gathered the remaining children and made an announcement that would fracture the family further. Alexis, he declared, was no longer part of the family. He instructed his children not to speak to her again, not to acknowledge her, not even to answer her calls. But Alexis was not easily silenced. With Rachel's help, she launched a blog, a digital journal dedicated to sharing her mother's story, seeking the truth, and gathering public support. What started as a deeply personal space soon grew into something much more powerful. Messages began to pour in from strangers, some offering condolences, others sharing disturbing patterns. Most notably, women began reaching out. Women who claimed they had once been romantically involved with Martin McNeil during his marriage to Michelle. Though not direct proof of any wrongdoing, the growing accounts painted a portrait of a man whose double life stretched far beyond what his family had suspected. Emboldened by the momentum, Alexis and Rachel took everything they had to law enforcement. They didn't yet have physical evidence of foul play, but the web of deceit was growing hard to ignore. 2 detectives took particular interest. Quietly at first, they began to review Martin's background. The deeper they looked, the more inconsistencies and outright fabrications they uncovered. The man who had long introduced himself as Doctor. Martin McNeil turned out to have an origin story that was anything but honorable. To begin with, Martin had never completed high school, not in the traditional sense. When he applied to medical school, he used someone else's diploma. His entrance into the professional world had been built on falsehoods from the very beginning. And shortly after marrying Michelle, he had already faced criminal charges. Fraud. He had opened bank accounts using the name of a deceased person and written over $36,000 in bad checks. The items he purchased with that money bordered on the absurd. Extravagant jewelry, luxury furniture, dozens of pairs of socks and shoes, and even a year's worth of chocolate-covered cherries. He was eventually sentenced to 2 years in prison, but served only 180 days. Still, despite this stain on his record, he somehow became licensed as a physician. His military service raised additional concerns. While briefly enlisted, Martin had reported hearing voices. The condition led to a discharge, yet he continued collecting a veteran's pension, reportedly $3,000 per month for decades, even while earning significant income as a practicing doctor. Then, in 2009, a stunning development pushed the investigation forward. Both Martin and Gypsy were arrested, not in connection with Michelle's death, but for a different crime entirely: identity theft. They had sent Giselle, one of the adopted McNeil daughters, back to her birth country under the guise of a short visit. They told her it would only be 2 months, but then they cut off contact. It was never a family trip. It was a scheme. Martin and Gypsy used Giselle's identity, her name, her social security number, to create a false persona: Jillian McNeil. This fictional daughter allowed Gypsy to apply for new financial accounts and loans in an effort to erase her debt and escape her poor credit history. The plan might have worked if investigators hadn't been quietly observing. Martin was arrested at the airport. Gypsy was detained later that same day at the McNeil residence. The charges were serious. The court found them both guilty. Martin was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Gypsy received a 2-year sentence. And for the first time in years, the illusion of invincibility surrounding Martin began to crack. With both now incarcerated, detectives turned their full attention to Michelle's death. They re-examined and requested a more comprehensive toxicology review. The results were troubling. Multiple prescription medications were discovered in Michelle's system, 4, possibly 5, all present in quantities that raised questions. From the very beginning, Martin McNeil insisted that he had done everything he could to save his wife. But when paramedics arrived at the McNeil residence, something didn't add up. As the medical team attempted resuscitation, they observed a significant amount of water gushing from lungs, far more than should have been present if proper life-saving measures had been administered at the time Martin claimed. In fact, trained responders knew that had real CPR been performed, particularly chest compressions, much of that water would have already been expelled. The inconsistencies continued to mount. But for years, the case remained frustratingly unresolved. The death had initially been ruled natural. There was no immediate criminal charge. Despite the growing suspicions from Michelle's daughters and the blog-driven campaign for justice launched by Alexis and Rachel, it seemed the system was slow to move. Then, in a stunning development, a major breakthrough arrived. In 2012, just 2 months after Martin had completed his prison sentence for identity theft, he was arrested again. This time, it wasn't for fraud. It wasn't for deception. It was for something far more serious: the murder of his wife, Michelle McNeil. The courtroom proceedings began in October 2013, drawing intense media attention and public interest. After weeks of testimony, the case was finally handed over to the jury. They deliberated for 11 hours, carefully weighing the evidence, the conflicting narratives, and the unsettling statements brought forward. Then, in November 2013, they returned to the courtroom with a decision. Martin McNeil was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift. He was ordered to serve life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. On April 6, 2017, just over 2 years into his life sentence, Martin was found unresponsive near the prison's greenhouse. In the months following his passing, legal documents emerged that revealed a change in his will, one made after Michelle's death. In that rewritten document, each of his children had been allocated exactly $1, just a symbolic amount, nothing more. The rest of his estate, everything of value, had been left to Gypsy Willis.